everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all, and today I want to discuss something that frankly terrifies me to even mention: BookTok. I am afraid of a couple of things in life: heights, roller coasters, Swifties. But right near the top of that list are BookTok girlies. But it seems that I must set aside my fear and venture into their territory, because I was recently told about how one of their conventions went disastrously sideways and somehow KINK got caught in the crossfire. So let's talk about the Sinners and Stardust situation, as someone who is both a lifestyle kinkster of 10 years and a longtime convention attendee. And I should probably first explain what BookTok even is, because I imagine that some of you have no idea what I mean by that. In short, BookTok is a community originally formed on TikTok centered on women who like to read books. While this is stereotypically associated with romance and spicy books, as they're often called, there are subsections of the community for just about every type of reader, regardless of their preferred genre or gender identity. But like most communities on TikTok, this quickly snowballed into a cavalcade of consumption. Just like WaterTok devolved into people fighting over exclusive Target Stanley Cup colors and buying dozens and dozens of syrup flavors they would only ever use once, so BookTok also devolved into people filling their shelves with special limited edition hardcover prints and rushing to buy as many books as possible. BookTok, along with associated communities of other social media platforms, is largely responsible for the significant surge in fiction reading among adults in recent years. And as a lifelong reader myself, I am happy to see that. But it's also gotten a little weird, too. BookTok sometimes promotes reading not just as a casual leisure activity, but more as a competitive sport. Goodreads and TikTok have become places not just to merely review new books, but to conspicuously consume them. The more, the better. The thumbnails feature BookTokers alongside dozens of stacked tomes, showcasing the vast amount of material they've consumed in the past month. Notably, some of the biggest influencers in the space promote a particular way of reading: buying new, physical copies of books for yourself. Used books, cheaper ebooks, or visiting the library are less often promoted because, then you might be less likely to use their Amazon affiliate links, and we can't have that. Maybe that's just me being cynical, because I do see other people promote those things as options, but the larger the creator, the more likely they are to focus on what gets money in their pocket, especially when the focus of their content is not just about discussing literature in detail, but about giving recommendations on what to buy and telling people what you've recently bought, plan to buy next, or have on your wish list. I realize this may sound like I'm saying some women don't really like to read. Actually, they're just faking it for attention, and I do not think that at all. The problem isn't women reading. The problem is the pressure of social media that makes it so we feel like we have to turn every hobby into a competitive side hustle, and influencer culture, which financially sustains that side hustle, turning everything into a consumerist hellscape. Listen, if drinking water can turn into an affiliate link-fueled nightmare, why wouldn't the same thing happen to books, too? But one offshoot of the consumer-focused popularity of books, especially romance books in recent years, has been the resurgence of the fan convention. While book conventions have always been around, at least in my experience, they've typically been more industry-focused, with notable exceptions for mega fandoms like Harry Potter, Twilight, and 50 Shades. A few oddities would pop up now and again. A series I'm a fan of, Kushiel's Legacy, has had masked ball events for years, but they were never anything huge. However, with the explosion of BookTok and new authors alongside it, it has opened up a whole new avenue for large-scale engagement. Unfortunately, these kinds of events, especially first-time ones run by people without previous experience, don't have a history of going well. We have known since the days of DashCon how terribly run such conventions can end up being, but that doesn't stop them from happening. One channel I really like, Swell Entertainment, has covered a number of these events. Some of them end up actually being pretty fun, and some of them end up not being so fun. Just in the past 2 years, there's been a rash of failed conventions and masked balls themed around romance novels, as people rush to cash in on the current BookTok craze and social media hype. Yet another entrant into this space is Sinners and Stardust, helpfully described on their Facebook page as a spicy romance book event that tends to lean towards the dark side, and on their website as a dark romance themed event. It was nearly impossible to find an itinerary or event schedule for either their Boston or New Orleans conventions. Their Instagram page was more helpful since the itinerary was preserved there. The event seemed to be more focused on one big ball, which was 21 plus to attend, alongside the opportunity to meet authors, shop for books and other dark romance themed goods, and do so in an 18 plus only space. They also had several panels and activities during the daytime too, featuring topics like psychology of dark romance, writing consent, and writing spice and kink. One activity I can't decide if I love or hate is a shibari crafting time, where people could make harnesses for teddy bears. Now is probably as good a time as any for me to mention that, spicy and dark romance labels kind of confuse me. I've always assumed that spicy is just TikTok censor code for any kind of sexual, but especially kink adjacent activity. But I wouldn't say that dark romance itself is inherently kinky, and clearly there are some distinctions between spice and kink, judging by the panel names. I also just sort of hate the term spicy, like it makes me cringe. If you are not a content creator trying to avoid getting your account deleted on TikTok, you really don't need to use the word spicy. Just say what it is without using cutesy euphemisms, but we'll talk more about the perils of falling for that later. This might be foreshadowing. So okay, this event was a genre enthusiast meetup with a fantasy ball attached. How could that possibly go wrong? Maybe the ballroom had no music, or none of the vendors showed up or something. Oh, if only those were the kinds of problems we were talking about today, I would not be making this video. So, quick content warning, this is where we start to discuss harassment and assault. But shortly after the most recent Sinners and Stardust event in mid-August, reports started rolling in, namely on threads about people being harmed during the event. One author reported that their friend was repeatedly backed into corners and groped without his consent multiple times by multiple women, to the point that his professionally airbrushed body paint had nearly entirely come off by the end of the night. One even went so far as to demand to tell them how he would kidnap a woman, and another even tried to hide an AirTag on him so they could follow him back to his hotel room. This behavior is shocking and disgusting, but it was far from the only types of violation that happened at this event. Another author reported that multiple people attempted to kiss them on the face without consent during meet and greet photos, and another author said that they were also groped repeatedly to the point that it brought them to tears. Other women said that their husbands were harassed by strangers at the convention whenever they were left alone. And yet another author stated they had someone try to violate their privacy in the bathroom by attempting to peek under their bathroom stall. Another woman, who stated she worked with the event on social media, proudly showed herself whipping out a hidden strap-on from under her dress during the ball, while allegedly also flashing attendees throughout the event while in the elevator and other parts of the event space, while also taking photos without people's consent. Someone else reported that there were people performing acts of fellatio on dildos out in public as well. The sheer number of reports coming out about this event is disturbing, and that leads me to wonder, why was this kind of behavior so common here? But before I get to that, just to make it unambiguously clear, none of that was okay. I don't care if you're in an 18 plus con, a dark fantasy meetup, a kink dungeon, anywhere with anyone. Do not treat people like that. Actors and authors are not your toys. Their bodies do not exist for your entertainment. You are not entitled to touch anyone, and yes, even as a woman touching a man, that is still not okay. Just treat people with some basic human decency and respect. Oh my God. From the reaction online, it seems like everyone agrees with this idea, but I guess a lot of you still don't get it, so it needs to be repeated. The event, at least for their part, seems to have taken this seriously. There's a video on TikTok of some of the organizers clearly stating that people need to ask permission before touching other people, and that they want to promote a safe, sane, and consensual night. Their website and social media materials, unfortunately though, lack any kind of publicly viewable consent policy or incident reporting process, both of which would have been sorely needed for this event. And I hope they consider implementing both of those things in the future. When all this started to break on social media, they posted in response that they would be making changes to the event to increase safety, including limiting the number of attendees, banning non-medical masks, and making author and employee-only areas, while also removing the roving entertainer aspect of the event entirely. I think these things are a good first step, and I believe that the organizers do care about consent. Their speech on the first night, as well as the fact that they had a whole panel about just consent, says as much. But in my opinion, as someone who has attended anime and gaming conventions for nearly a decade, as well as 18+ only cons, you're going to need to do more. If you don't have a security and safety team, you need to build one. You need to have a way for people to anonymously and securely report consent violations when they happen, so you don't only ever hear about them after the event takes place when someone just happens to be brave enough to publicly share their experience in public on social media. And while security for authors is a great idea, attendees also deserve their consent being respected too. Roving monitors with clearly visible vests, checking to make sure people are acting within the boundaries of the event rules isn't a bad idea. And frankly, I might consider rethinking offering people alcohol entirely. I know, call me a buzzkill, but if you are mixing strangers, alcohol, and a sexually charged environment all together, especially without any kind of required orientation or consent training or monitor thing going on, that is just asking for trouble, no matter what banners, waivers, or policies you put into place. And ideally, if you want to have such a sexually charged environment at all, you ought to be very explicitly telling people what kind of behavior is and is not okay, rather than leaving it up to chance. And they ought to be a little more careful with their marketing too. I haven't seen many people bring this up, but their Instagram feed in particular has numerous examples of what I would call confusing behavior that might give people the wrong idea about what is acceptable at Sinners and Stardust. There's videos of entertainers grabbing women from behind and holding them by the throat. There's videos of women spitting in each other's mouths, and photos of women touching and holding each other in sexually suggestive ways. I say this not to absolve the bad actors of this event, but to highlight that this could actually be a broader issue with the event's culture as it's currently being promoted. If you imply through your social media activity that certain behavior is not just okay, but is celebrated and promoted, they might get the wrong idea about what they're allowed to do. So okay, those are some of my ideas for how to prevent bad outcomes in the future. However, we still need to discuss why all this happened. People on the internet were quick to blame the genre of books themselves, declaring, "This is what happens when you normalize abuse," or "What did you expect from people who think violence is hot?" I've heard many similar things said about KINK, and for all my gripes with TikTok, I do not think this is the reason for why what happened. This kind of behavior has repeated itself across many, many different types of fan spaces, whether it be anime conventions, Comic-Con, furry conventions, and even places like VidCon and BronyCon. Anime conventions in particular were notorious for bad attendee behavior, with cons eventually having to adopt the mantra that cosplay is not consent because violations were so rampant. I would argue that the flavor of event matters far, far less in this equation than the energy of a convention and fandom culture itself. Remember how I said that BookTok is often a consumerist rat race? About that. I think that's a contributing factor here, not because dark romance is uniquely prone to this, but because social media and influencer culture as a whole are unfortunately trending in this direction. Parasociality has mutated in such a way that some see authors and influencers as props for their entertainment rather than as human beings. Consent is merely implied because of their availability at the event, what they talk about in their works, or what they say on social media. But she was asking for a spicy book girly pop edition, if you will. This ranges from the seemingly innocuous, like assuming someone is okay with you hugging them, to the outrageous, like presuming it's okay to ask a voice actor to reenact a scene from one of your favorite spicy novels with you. Trend chasing and making your hobbies into a publicly consumable aspect of your identity only amplifies these issues. If I was going to blame BookTok or dark romance specifically for any of the problems at hand here, it would be because of this. There's an unfortunate subsection of the self-identified booktalker/booktuber set, especially viewers, who have made reading these books both their entire personality and their entire social outlet. What works as a tongue-in-cheek inside fandom joke in a TikTok comment can be wildly inappropriate when directed at, say, an author at a fan meetup. It also causes adult women to do things like, I don't know, sexually harass a teenager on TikTok because he happens to like motorcycles and reading books. They get so lost in the sauce, they forget they're interacting with real flesh and blood people on the other side of their screens. And if they said half the things that they did online in person, they would be on a watch list. And these are not even the only examples. In 2023, when hockey romances were trending, a little social media back and forth with the Seattle Kraken got wildly out of hand, with people leaving increasingly harassing comments towards one player and his wife after she dared to say that how people were behaving towards her husband was making her uncomfortable. And just a couple of months ago, a group of firefighters on duty walked into an author's event space, leading to probably 100+ women to cheer and scream for them while being asked if any of them were single, with the incident being declared a meet cute by the pair on stage. While that kind of thing may seem innocuous, like, I don't know, assuming someone wants to hug you compared to anything else we talked about today, I think this reflects a culture that we've been talking about. If this had been a group of female nurses walking in to attend an MTG conference and a huge swath of men screamed at them and someone on stage asked if any of them were single, we would rightly identify that as harassment, especially because as first responders, they have no choice about being there and cannot easily remove themselves from the scenario if they do feel uncomfortable. So clearly, this is a long-standing issue with the BookTok community, and it has yet to be adequately addressed. But why are we still here? Why don't people realize their behavior is wrong? Again, I don't think it's the genre itself so much as BookTok culture and our larger cultural understanding of consent on the whole. One thing I have noticed from my forays into spicy literature is that it is very trope dependent. Readers have expectations about what kind of experience they're going to have while reading such a book, and they do approach the work differently than they would a traditional mystery or sci-fi novel. They largely don't really want to be surprised, or they want to be surprised in different ways than they would with other genres. They want to know what they're going to get with the tropes that they want. They want to be delivered in varying flavors with different set dressing on top, essentially, for a lot of folks. And for romance in particular, a happily ever after is essentially the defining trait of that kind of work, and it's a must-have for the characters. So in a lot of ways, it ends up being a sort of comfort process for people. It's an act of self-care to read books like this. People aren't reading in this genre often to be challenged, although some do use it to help them process their own life experiences too, and I don't want to erase the people who use books like that in this way. But for many, they're reading often for the same reason that your friend is on their 10th time through watching The Office from start to finish, but with a spicier connotation. This easily enables what I would term the sopification of such content, because some readers aren't really reading for depth most of the time. They're skimming and speed reading to get to the good bits and then earmarking their favorite passages. This approach does not lend itself to either critical analysis or thoughtful consumption, and I would argue that the use of censorship-influenced meme language like spicy or KINK, hate that one in particular, it just sounds, in the mouth it sounds wrong, KINK, But anyways, within this community, it furthers the issue because it causes people to create an even further separation between themselves and their sexuality and the content that they are consuming. As writer Magdalene J. Taylor put it, quote, "It's really flattened things. It's all mediated through these memified terms, and I think that allows people to distance themselves from the physical reality of sex and relationships." So even if consent is given due regard in the source material, it's often skipped over or not fully processed. But explicit consent in dark romance is not done the way that we would do it in real life, and consent is typically implied through the pleasure of the character's experiences, because, orgasm equals consent, or the romantic relationship that ends up developing. Or consent is assumed simply because of the fact it's a book, and we believe that on some level, the characters really want what is happening to them to be happening, even if they don't know it at the time in the narrative and come around to it later. I'm not saying that books need to be consent primers, but it not being present at all or only being present in dubious ways is not helping the situation. We saw the extreme end of this with 50 Shades, and that led to an uptick in people heading out to sex toy stores to pick up cheap floggers and handcuffs without adequate instruction. But it's not a book's job to offer consent instruction. It's merely the last possible line of defense we have in helping readers separate fantasy from reality. A broader lack of media literacy worsens the issue when compounded with the genre's proclivity towards non-critical reading habits, and that further compounds with the real source of this issue: how our culture treats consent in general. I know I sure didn't get an adequate education about consent growing up in America, and no one I know did. Even today, in most places, education is still lacking. We are taught that, at best, we should stop when we hear a no, but we aren't taught that pleasure or orgasms aren't consent, or that the absence of a no is not a yes, or what coercion and pressure looks like. We aren't taught how to negotiate with our partners or how to ask for what we want. Heck, we aren't even taught how to know what we want in the first place. Seduction and silent, spontaneous encounters are treated as the ideal, and vanilla monogamous culture in America is still rife with poor consent practices that go almost entirely unchallenged. Outside of relationships, very few people are doing the work to unlearn the potentially harmful way of practicing consent, or lack thereof, that was modeled to them. And that's the issue. Good consent is never being modeled for a lot of people. Not from their families, not from their teachers, not from their partners, or the media that they consume. Good consent simply does not exist. And so you take potentially decades of poor consent modeling, add in yet another form of media that still does not model good consent, mix that with an event that isn't directly teaching people about what consent looks like either, add a little bit of booze, and bam, you have got what happened at Sinners and Stardust. It's not the genre, it's not the books. It's layers and layers and layers of poor consent culture twisting together to make a poor behavior pot that is ready to boil over at a moment's notice. I think if we lived in a world in which consent was normalized and we were taught about it in an age-appropriate way from early on, what happened at that con would not have taken place, because people would have had the skills necessary to separate reality from fiction and to understand that just because a character does something they like in a book does not mean that the voice actor would be flattered by being asked to recreate it with you. They could look at the fiction they love with a critical eye and go, yep, I get that this is a novel, but if you want to do it in real life, you always need to talk about it first. And while that might seem like the absolute bare minimum, because it is, obviously, a lot of people aren't able to do this. And not because it's mommy porn and it's rotted their brains, it's because it's about the culture we have around consent, vanilla or not, and that was already rotten the entire time. But that brings me to kink. As I said before, I wouldn't consider dark romance to be a kink thing, although lots of kinky folk do enjoy dark romance. The whole reason I decided to talk about this in the first place is that somehow in this conversation, some wires got crossed somewhere and kink got dragged into this fiasco. As one person on Threads put it, quote, "Unfortunately what happened at Sinners and Stardust is the consequences of people entering kink spaces without being properly educated. These dark romances feature themes that seem non-consensual, but in the real world, scenes played out would require enthusiastic consent from all parties, as well as check-ins before and after a scene took place. This isn't a playground made for people to commit actual sexual crimes. This was a fantasy ball, not a dungeon/club. And if you acted like that in a dungeon/club, they would kick you out and ban you. My heart is with all the victims. I'm sorry for what happened to you at the hands of others who believed you were safe with." And on this point, yes, I absolutely agree. Any convention I've ever been to would have kicked these people out and blacklisted them for the kinds of behavior that they reportedly did at Sinners and Stardust. But it seems that some people saw this thread and either got confused and didn't read the whole thing, or made their own connections between what happened and kink that I found troubling. For example,
y'all want to read about these things and act it out in real life. You can do that. You find the right community. Find your kink space and seek that out in real life if you want to do stuff like that. I'm sure you can find places where there's something and maybe everybody has agreed to consent, non-consent, borderline, non-consensual, groping, whatever. This is not to kink shame, because that was not the place for y'all to be doing those things. This was a convention, yes, for the grown and sexy, I guess, but that doesn't mean you just get to touch people and grope people. And again, there are places for this type of behavior. It's not here. If this is your jam, fine. If you want to be cheering on friend, doing thing friend is doing, fine. In the right space. Find your kink community and go there and do those things there. Not at a dark romance bookish space.
And to be clear, what I think they probably mean, what I hope they mean by this, is that you should find an appropriate space to do your kinks. Do them where people consent to stuff like this. And to a certain extent, for some things, I agree. Because there was a seeming lack of rules on the website because of some aspects of the advertising. I could see how otherwise uneducated people might assume that it could be appropriate to whip out a dildo in public and start doing things to it. And that is similar to something you might see in some kink spaces. Since it's a spicy 18+ event, but that's also not necessarily appropriate in kink spaces either. Like, kink conventions are not going to have people doing things in the elevator, in the room hallways, and so on. There are specifically marked spaces and times where you know that kind of behavior might happen, but it's not about wantonly doing what you want wherever you feel like it. And to me, this in some ways feels like recommending polyamory to a serial cheater. Are there cheaters who wouldn't cheat if they had known polyamory was an option and they would be good and ethical at polyamory? Sure, but that is probably the exception and not the rule, because a lot of cheaters don't cheat because they simply feel forced to comply with monogamy and just don't see a way out of it, and they're straining at those boundaries. In fact, most people who go on to be polyamorous are at first serially monogamous, and they tend to break up with whoever their current partner is whenever they feel drawn to a new person due to the guilt and shame they feel, and because they believe in the notion that because they have these feelings, their existing partner must not be the one for them. Whereas a lot of cheaters are motivated by the taboo, by the power it gives them over their partner, or by their ability to get away with something. Ethical polyamory removes that taboo and power, and for so many cheaters, it therefore has no appeal. And also because, in no small part, it makes it so that other parties can also have multiple relationships, which is something that cheaters are, funnily enough, generally not down with. And I think people who try to get away with doing inappropriate things in public often feel similarly about their behavior. They like the taboo, that it's wrong, that they might get caught, and because it gives them power over other people. They might even be doing something to stand out and seem edgy on purpose. But if you were to do that same behavior consensually in a kink setting, suddenly it's not so taboo or so different anymore. It doesn't have that same sparkle. Not to mention folks with such a loose grasp on consent probably wouldn't like all the rules and structure we have in kink anyway. And then there's the fact that most of the behavior that happened at this convention has nothing to do with kink in the first place, or even just sex positivity. Putting air tags on people, looking under bathroom stalls, surprise kissing strangers? Yeah, none of that would fly. Maybe if you did an elaborate pre-planned scene around those things, you could role play those behaviors with a consenting party in a CNC type of way. But role play often doesn't appeal to people like this because, one, they probably don't see the people they're doing it to as autonomous human beings worthy of respect, and two, they don't have the knowledge or self-discipline to figure out how to do these things in an ethical way because it's all spontaneous, in-the-moment decision-making, and it's normally not that robust. Plus all of the reasons that we just talked about. In summary, assault is not kink, and the problem is not merely that assaulters don't have an appropriate outlet for their otherwise normal ethical desires. The problem is often that they either want to or don't care about violating people's boundaries in the first place. Some of them, I am sure, could learn to satisfy their desires in a healthy way through kink, but I don't think that's what most of them really want. And that brings me to my second example, because sometimes what people said went beyond just find an appropriate place to do your kinks, all the way over into suggesting that the kind of behavior that was on display at Sinners and Stardust happens at kink events, despite them having no direct experience attending any such event.
Part of the reaction was, why on earth, how do you think you can convince us you didn't mean harm? Why did you think it'd be okay to just walk around with an adult toy like that? Again, I don't say this to justify it. I do not say this to justify it. However, there is a setting in which that would be okay, and it is a kink festival. There are festivals centering around various adult activities that people can partake in. At those sorts of conventions, this sort of behavior would be welcome. The slob on the knob one's a lot. I don't know if that, I've never actually been to one, but I have a friend that goes. You guys aren't gonna believe me on that. I swear. I'm asking for a friend. So I don't know. I actually don't know if the slob on the knob one would be okay or not, because she has told me some crazy stories. But that sort of behavior is welcome in that kind of environment. And I had the thought that I wonder if because dark romance is viewed as the kinkiest form of romance that you can like to read, I wonder if there weren't people who expected it to be a fictional kink festival, and that behavior that would be acceptable at a kink festival would also be acceptable here because it's fictional kink, if that makes sense.
What it seems like from the surrounding context of the video is that they're also specifically referring to the dildo incidents here, but I want to be clear. No behavior like this is not common at kink conventions. People do not go up to strangers and flash them, and if they did, they would be kicked out. Maybe with friends and people you know, you might do something like that in an appropriate area, but again, nothing like the other stories would have ever been tolerated. The air tags, the groping, the bathroom stuff, any of that. Absolutely not. This doesn't mean everyone who has ever attended a kink convention is a good person. People do break the rules, and a very long time ago, I actually discussed this in a really, really old video about a now defunct convention that actually ended up shutting down in part because people were breaking the rules. At least a few individuals propositioned hotel staff, took their sex toys into vanilla areas, or did kinky stuff in public areas where they should not have been doing anything. But all of these things were against the stated values of the con and the rules, and because of these bad apples, the convention ended up getting a bad reputation, and no one wanted to work with them anymore. Kink conventions work really hard, for the most part, to maintain a good relationship with hotels and event centers because it is hard to find places who will host us, and also because we just want to be good, consent-minded people, generally. Every kink convention I have ever attended has very clearly marked spaces to indicate where certain behavior is allowed or not. They make everyone sign multiple waivers to show that they understand and agree to follow the rules, and everyone there has to be sober. They also have monitors everywhere to make sure people are following the rules, and they get kicked out when they don't. That is what is normal. This is also part of the reason why I feel more safe at kink conventions compared to other types of events, even ones that aren't necessarily 18 plus, because they just take safety and consent super, super seriously. The problem is not, they just thought they were going to a kink con and this kind of behavior would have been totally normal for a place like that. Because that's not the case. If they did think that and they had any experience going to actual kink events, they would have known that their behavior wouldn't have been tolerated by and large in a kink venue. with, as I mentioned before, maybe a couple of edge cases where in the right part of a kink con at the right time, you know, maybe you could put a dildo on a wall for a bit as long as it was, you know, in an appropriate area. And so I don't want to play this blame game of like, oh, well, this happened because people thought maybe they were going to a kink convention, or if they had been to a kink convention, this kind of thing would have been okay. Like, no one is putting air tags in people's backpacks as like a fun little inside joke that's acceptable in a kink space. Like, do people wear air tags as like a little tracking thing in a consensual DS relationship? Sure, maybe, probably, but like not anything that happened at Sinners and Stardust, okay? It's just all really frustrating. Don't throw kink under the bus, please. I promise this isn't our fault. And like, actually, if anything, maybe BookTok conventions could learn a thing or two from kink conventions in terms of how we handle and communicate consent, because it is very, very, very obvious what the rules are, and they make sure you know what the rules are before you sign up, before you get through the door, and there's monitors everywhere to make sure that you are actually following the rules. And God, this whole situation is just so disgusting, and like, I obviously have my ideas about how this is happening and why it's happening. I think a lot of it obviously has to do with just general fandom culture and influencer culture, and the fact that for some reason every year more people in a deeper way seem to not be able to see internet figures as actual whole human beings worthy of respect, as opposed to like interactive toys. It's so bizarre to me that keeps getting worse, but it seems to be. In any case, let me know your thoughts about this one in a comment down below, especially if you are somebody who is part of BookTok or you read dark romance. You know, again, I'm a lifelong reader. I'm a longtime convention attendee. I don't necessarily read dark romance, but I do read sort of adjacent genres, so I'm a little bit familiar with what's going on there. And again, if you're blaming the genre for this, you are way on the wrong side of the map on this one. But in any case, again, let me know your thoughts in a comment down below. If you did enjoy this, please do subscribe, because I make videos every week about kink and BDSM related subjects. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best thing to do is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.